everybody. Welcome to another edition of Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon. And we're here today with Nathan Smith. Nathan is a interesting person. And we decided we'd read his biography to you because it is such an interesting biography. So I'll go ahead and read that. Nathan is a writer and YouTuber, as well as an undergraduate student in psychology at Texas State University. He is currently applying to graduate programs, fingers crossed, to become a psychotherapist. Nathan served a mission in California from 2013 to 2015, where he experienced some of the best and worst that the LDS Church had to offer. He returned home with PTSD and didn't open up about his experiences until 2018. Since then, he has written over 100 essays on Medium for a publication called Interfaith Now, exploring his experiences and trying to identify some of the challenges he feels the modern LDS Church faces. Though no longer a Latter-day Saint himself, Nathan still has a deep love for Mormonism and those who feel called to it. And as a student of psychology and a wannabe therapist, he's interested in helping people of any religious tradition, or none whatsoever, find the healthiest, most fulfilling version of their lives possible, whatever that may look like. So welcome, Nathan.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to join y'all.
Yes, welcome. And I think we also need to add to that bio, why don't we mention the name of your wonderful new podcast?
Oh, yes. So I am on YouTube as Mind Makes This World. I think I have about 9 videos out now on just a very brief hiatus, but I've got some more content that I'm working on that I'd like to get out there. So, go and subscribe, please.
Like and subscribe. That's right.
Yes.
We all, those of us that are newer to YouTube and all of that, we need to always remember, like and subscribe. That's what we're supposed to say. So, well, welcome. We are just so excited. And I also want to mention that Nathan has been kind enough. He's going to come talk to our The Good Book Club members, which will probably happen before we even air this. But we just love it that Nathan is so willing to give back and to support and to talk to us and share his knowledge and his experiences. So I think we'll just, Landon, why don't we start with a first question for Nathan and we'll just jump right in.
Sure. I will say I was watching your YouTube videos today from Mind Makes This World. And I got to say, you're brilliant. Some of the I was just following those going, wow, these are really scholarly. You really know your stuff, and we'll explain why here as we get talking to him.
We'll get to that.
where he got this knowledge from. So I guess the first question is, tell us a little bit about yourself. About your growing up and where you grew up and how you got to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the compliments, by the way. Y'all are too kind. So I was born in Houston, Texas. I only lived there a couple of years. I lived most of my life in Austin, Texas, and I was raised in a very more or less traditional Mormon family, as traditional as they get outside of like the Mormon corridor. I was, raised through kind of just the basic milestones. Like 8, I was baptized. 12, I became a deacon, teacher, priest. 18, I was in the Melchizedek priesthood, and then 19, I went on my mission. It's funny. It was an interesting time growing up in basically what was the literal Texas shaped belt buckle of the Bible Belt, because you're surrounded by like very passionate evangelical Christians, Baptists, Protestants of just all kinds and shapes and sizes. And I grew up in a town where it was when I was much younger, it was much worse. There were churches that were very focused on trying to teach classes on how to proselytize to your Mormon friends, how to save them. And it was based on a lot of like that old school 19th century kind of crap. So it wasn't very intellectually engaging. It was just more like, do you know the Mormons don't believe in the Bible? Did you know they worship Joseph? Stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the church I went to was vandalized once. It was just once, but spray painting, windows broken. They had to put up shrubs and stuff because the sandstone, it stained the sandstone. So there's still graffiti kind of faded there, but it was an interesting time for sure.
So was that one of the first times that you recognized, oh my goodness, Mormons are not, I mean, were you fairly insulated from that, or was that something that made you go, wow, this is next level? Mormons are hated, or?
Well, it's tough to say because I think it's just the water I swam in. I think I kind of always knew we were a little weird. I grew up with a best friend of mine who was like, his parents were very Baptist, and they were the type that loved to invite the missionaries in and, have their little debates with them.
Oh,
Yeah, I remember this friend of mine. He actually, I think it was like probably right after I was 8. He and I were playing in his backyard, and he had this moment where he had to witness to me about how afraid he was that I don't have Jesus in my heart. And so I accepted Jesus into my heart right then and there with him. And it was about as spiritual as 2 8-year-old boys in the backyard can really be. But
you were making the effort. No, I relate to that
Yeah.
because I had a friend that was a very, very staunch Baptist in high school. And one day, and I had, of course, a little posse of Mormon girls around me. And one day she broke down in the lunchroom and we said, Cassie, what's wrong? She said, I just love you guys and you're all going to hell. I mean, that was very strange. We all just kind of looked up because we didn't really understand that that's how it was viewed for other religions. And she said, yeah, my minister has told me that my friends are going to hell. And she was very sincere. I mean, she was absolutely sincerely concerned, and we of course didn't know what to think, so
She may have even been correct. Yeah.
oh, okay.
We'll see.
We'll see.
We'll see.
It's
Oh,
funny.
my
I
goodness.
none of my siblings are Mormon anymore, and recently I saw my younger sister and oldest sister, and we were all having a joke and everything, and I think one of us had used the Lord's name in vain, and we had a moment where we were like, but it might be real though, so maybe just
Yeah.
double back real quick.
Better safe than sorry, right?
Just
No,
in
I think a
case,
lot
right?
of post-Mormons go through that where you're like, can I
Yeah,
do this?
yeah.
Is somebody watching me? So oh
Oh
wow,
goodness.
that is so interesting. Well, that sounds like an amazing growing up. And so you had older sisters, younger sibling, you were kind of right there in the middle of the family.
Yeah.
That's excellent. That's excellent. And so were you always interested in sort of like even younger as were you interested in the scholarship of the church? I mean, most kids are like, whatever, but it sounded to me like some of the other things I've watched, you actually you were thinking about it, even at a very young age and trying to understand.
Yeah, I really don't know what kicked that off. I guess maybe it's just a very organic kind of thing that I felt drawn to. But at 13, I started reading just a bunch of, well, I guess the baby's first Mormon scholarship starter kit, which is a lot of Cleon Skousen
Oh
apparently.
my God.
Yeah.
I was raised on Skousen to the nth degree. My
Yes.
parents, I called them Skousenites. That's how bad, not how bad, that's how interesting it was at my
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I learned a little bit, but I also had like a bishop who was, I think he was a research assistant for Hugh Nibley. So I got a lot of Hugh Nibley kind of thrown in there too. But I don't know. I think that for me, it was exciting because it took what was just kind of like a background element of my life that was just kind of there and turned it into this like very real and engaging thing. Like it felt like, oh, Mormonism isn't just like the weird thing that I do on Sunday, and my friend who can't read Harry Potter like he thinks I'm the weird one for. Like it's a real deal. Like we're doing something. My life is concretely affected by this, and so I wanted to know it as much in detail as I could, as much as like kind of that more conservative or even fundamentalist approach to Mormonism really can help you out.
Right. So you were interested in the meat. You were finding that in Skousen and Nibley and at a very
Yeah.
young age. That's so interesting.
Yeah,
And that led you to eventually become an apologist at a very young age. Tell us a little bit about that and how
This
that came
story is
about.
incredible. I just
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was, it actually kind of starts when I was 16. So I had this like very interesting out of nowhere faith crisis, mostly centered on atonement theology and then like Mormon exclusivism. So like one true church rhetoric and stuff. And I remember having this moment where I was sitting in a sacrament meeting, hearing about Jesus suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think to myself, like, even if I saw this as purely symbolic, I don't know what it would be symbolic of. This feels like kind of like a useless thing for me, but I don't know what to do with that. I'm, a 16-year-old boy and
right.
living in a more or less, faithful Mormon household. But so I dug into that a whole lot. So I started reading a lot of people, including like generally Christian writers. Like N.T. Wright is still kind of one of my favorites. He's an interesting guy. There's a lot of ways I obviously nowadays would disagree with him, but he was a very thoughtful person, and I think he helped to to make Christianity, in fact, a lot more realistic for me, in the same way that like Skousen kind of made Mormonism more realistic for me. So I started digging deeper and deeper into, I guess, what would have been like the issues surrounding Mormonism, and that drew me to what was at the time called Fair Mormon. And they had I don't know if they still have it, but they had two websites at the time. One was like a page for their conference talks, and at the time, at least, some free books you could read just on the browser. And they had kind of a Wikipedia style website, which was like, here's a question or an issue, and here's like a whole wiki page with like even related pages and hyperlinks and everything to like responses to that. And I found myself just diving down every possible rabbit hole I could find, to the point that I saw a little link on one of their websites that said, hey, why don't you volunteer to answer emails that people send in? I had sent in a couple of my own, and I thought, why not? That could be fun. So I did. And my application was lost the first time around, so I didn't get in for a couple months. And then I wrote them. I was like, hey, can I join? And they're like, hey, yeah, we switched people. Welcome aboard. And then the next day I woke up to like 100 emails in my inbox. So.
And they never ask about your age. It was okay that you were much younger. That was never an issue.
I can't remember if they asked specifically for my age, but I don't think they were bothered by it, if I remember correctly. Especially because, I mean, it's a church that sends like, now at least, 18-year-old boys to.
It was started by a 14-year-old boy. So
yeah.
Right,
so
you're right. Definitely a youth culture. So,
yeah.
Oh my goodness. So.
Sorry, were your responses reviewed by somebody, or did you just go straight out and respond?
Yeah, so once you had the application process in, that was pretty much like the primary vetting process. But once you were actually a person, like a volunteer apologist, what would happen is you would receive like all the emails that were sent in would be forwarded to everybody who is a volunteer apologist. And if you responded, you would preface your email every time by saying, hey, these are my reflections, my views. They don't necessarily reflect the views of either Fair Mormon or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So that kind of gave a little bit of plausible deniability if one of us went off the rails. And other people could see your responses and jump into and be like, hey, maybe I see this slightly differently, or hey, here's some resources that this person, may not have noticed that you might find helpful, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Wow, what an environment. So you're not only getting questions, you're also learning from other apologists, all delving into some of the same questions, and you're going back and forth with each other about what about this and that. And then you're helping people understand and feel comfortable with some of the rough issues. So wow, what a really intellectually dynamic time for somebody who's not even 18. That's incredible.
Yeah. Yes.
What did your parents think of you doing that? I'm just trying to picture my sons,
Proud.
they're all young adults now. I'm trying to picture my 16-year-old mom. I cannot vacuum. I am answering the Adam God question from
They're gonna be so mad when I say this. I don't think they cared.
They weren't impressed. That's the other thing. I think you go, my son, the apologist.
I don't think they understood what was what I was kind of up to, but I also don't think it's funny because I'm not 100% sure where y'all like grew up, but in Texas, I think that we I don't know. It's not like Mormon identity is not really a point of pride for anyone, to the point that I've grown up with people who are like, I'm the distant great-great-grandson of this particular 3-named general authority. And everybody's like, I don't care. Like, I've got work tomorrow morning, like hours already. But yeah, I don't know if they cared. I remember my dad, at the time at least, kind of seeing the academic side of things as almost like a waste of time, which is kind of, I think he's outgrown that, but it was kind of that somewhat typical, maybe anti-intellectual side of Mormonism. Right. And then I don't think my mom just really understood what I was up to. I think they just knew I was alone in my room doing emails and, doing
emails. That's so funny. Like their son, you got to put this away. Can't you get a good video game that you can be addicted to? Come on. I'm trying to think of what it would have been back in the day, but yeah. It
wasn't the most shocking thing a 17-year-old boy could be doing alone on a computer. So I think they were okay with that.
You were in a unique spot where you got to see, especially you're kind of at the beginning time of a lot of people starting to have a faith crisis. Did you see a lot of emails over the time you were there? Did it increase fairly significantly? What was your feel as you watched it? Did you have a feeling that people were really starting to find out these issues and that's why they were going there, or did you have a feel for that at all?
That was a discussion we often had on that email list. Was at the time, I don't know if the people would be using this term anymore, but at the time we called it inoculating the saints. So there was this sense in which like these issues were becoming way more prominent, way more obvious because, Internet 2.0, everyone's online. There's no real filter or anything. So people get to see this information that at times was maybe just not known, at times was maybe just quietly disregarded. And we wanted to prep people to be able to, process that information when they first encountered it. So I don't know if I saw like an uptick in the emails necessarily, because I think that we had kind of a feature that wasn't super popular as far as like emailing questions in. But I did get a sense, and I think a lot of people on the email list would definitely agree, that we had this sense that there was kind of an uptick in, at the very least, questions and maybe even faith crises. And we wanted to kind of address that as best we could.
That's so interesting. Can you think of any particular questions that were becoming more and more, like rising to the top, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that probably the two biggest ones were LGBT issues and plural marriage.
Yeah.
I remember having some very interesting conversations with people about plural marriage. I remember I thought I was a very progressive person about this, and I think even to this day I was still very progressive about it, in the sense of like, hey, find your answers, whatever it is, good luck to you. And this person kept emailing back, no, you only are giving me the fair answers and the rote church answers. And I'm like, I'm not giving you any answers. If anything, I'm terribly unhelpful. Like, I'm not sure what you're accusing me of, but yeah, it was plural marriage and LGBT plus issues, specifically issues related to sexual orientation. I think gender identity hadn't quite really reached mainstream.
And what year are we
LDS
talking
thought.
about?
This would have been, I started in December 2011 and
Okay.
I finished in March 2013.
Yeah, that makes sense. Exactly right there in that time frame.
I remember the most controversial thing I think I saw was I can't remember his name, unfortunately, but there was a BYU student who made this very interesting presentation kind of in the aftermath of Prop 8 about homosexuality and the gospel. And he was arguing essentially that he thinks that the presidents of the church and the apostles were mistaken in their views about it. And I remember at the time thinking, that's such I can't go there yet. Like cognitively, I can't process that idea just yet, but it was definitely an interesting time for sure.
How did the experience affect your own spirituality? It seems to me I heard, were you a strong believer at that time, or did it cause you to struggle, or how did it affect your own testimony having to deal with that?
Funny enough, I don't think it actually affected me like in any negative way. I don't recall having any like crises of faith while I was with Fair Mormon. I think it was such an incremental shift for me. But by the time I left on my mission, I had kind of an atheist phase, a closeted atheist phase. The Fair didn't need to know about at the time. But
was that the result of Fair, or was that just some other things that you were delving into once you left Fair?
It's funny. I was never, the issues that always bothered me were never historical stuff. Like I really didn't have a hard time processing that Joseph Smith might have been a pervert, or like that we were racist in a very recent past, or even in a present. Like for some reason that didn't not bother me, but like that didn't shake me. I had an easy time engaging the church as a human institution. But I think for me, the things that really like bugged me were existential stuff. Like I don't really understand Jesus. I'm not really 100% sure how to make sense of like why he would even exist in the first place. There's some philosophical issues there. Nowadays, I kind of get the idea a little bit more. I understand, the role that plays, even just in things like emotional regulation for some folks. But at the time, I was just like, I don't really get this guy, and I'm not 100% sure what you even mean when you use the word God. So like my head was kind of in that weird space. But
So
by the time,
thinking about the big questions.
Yeah, were you an atheist while working for Fair?
Yes, briefly. I had a brief moment, and I think I can't fully understand what it really was. I think it probably centered a little bit on like things like the problem of evil and suffering, and people have philosophically satisfying, responses to the problem of evil and suffering, but like it's still a very cruel and interesting world. And I don't know if sometimes we fully take that into account sometimes, but I think that was probably a big part of what kind of pushed me in that direction. But by the time I left, and I only left because I was going on my mission, in fact, I was probably much closer to like Terrell and Fiona Givens,
Right.
as far as like belief. So very nuanced, very progressive, very flexible. But there were a lot of things I also hadn't really thought about. Like I would like to think that I was at least pleasant about my views on like LGBT plus people. But I think that's something I never really thought about, and it wasn't really an issue that came to the forefront for me, at least until after my mission. Or even like women in the priesthood. I think I was probably a lot more progressive about that. I liked ordained women, even if I was maybe still kind of slightly conservative and very male about it sometimes. I think that, Terrell and Fiona Givens, they were probably a good touchstone for where I was at by the time I left.
Yeah, that's great. So we'll move on to your mission in a second, but I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned that you had interacted with some other more notable apologists who may have found their way a different path in more current years. Can you talk about that, or is it too
no,
sensitive
absolutely.
information?
I don't know. It's only spicy, I think, to the Mormon adjacent world.
That's
so,
right. Well, we want spicy. No.
Yeah. Here's the leaked documents.
That's it. Oh my gosh. Get ready, everybody.
Funny enough, actually, I did go back to my old email address to see if I could find my old Fair emails. Because I don't think they ever removed me from the list. So I think I was still receiving emails for a couple of years. But apparently Yahoo deletes all of your stuff if you don't log in for like 3 years. So fun. But so I got a chance to see, I think, a lot of people who are, I don't know if the proper term would be like bigger names, but people kind of at the beginning of their development, whatever approach to Mormonism they might have. Like I had the opportunity to become friends with a couple of folks that are now a big part of Book of Mormon Central. I knew Stephen Smoot before he had his blog Plony Alimony. I think that's how you pronounce it. Very sorry, Stephen, if you ever see this. And then I also got to meet Bill Reel, actually. I'm 120% sure he doesn't remember me, but I got to hear his first interview with John DeLynn on Mormon Stories when he was a bishop at the time. And I remember it was all I remember is it was a very, very heated discussion centered on gay people specifically. And then shortly after, Bill actually joined our email list. And I remember just sort of watching him, be one of the volunteer apologists like myself. I don't think we really interacted or anything. Like I said, he probably would never remember me anyway. But and then when I came back from my mission back in 2015, I had heard that I think that might have been the very beginning of Mormon discussions. So I was just like, wow, I've missed a lot.
You missed a lot. You got to catch up. So we'll make sure we send this to Bill with a little timestamp of where we discuss his past. So
yeah, for the record, Bill, you're a wonderful man.
Yeah. And then there were some others, I think you said. Was it who did you
I think I'm not sure if his name is well known. Neil Rapley, he's a big part of Book of Mormon Central, if I remember correctly. He was a very nice guy. And then I got to meet Jackson Washburn through some mutual friends in Fair after I came back from my mission. I think I might have met Jackson prior to his mission. But we have an acquaintanceship. He knows me, but we weren't like having I was gonna say having coffee, but having like hot chocolate on the weekends or
having
something.
Cocoa.
Yeah, having cocoa. But yeah,
so you were a mover and shaker. You were a mover and shaker at Fair.
It's funny because I was definitely not a mover or shaker. I just was kind of this is a weird analogy, but I feel like I was the Forrest Gump of Mormonism for a half second there.
There's our title, Landon. There's our title of
the Forrest Gump of Mormonism.
God, no, please. But you know how that movie worked, where he just like he meets like Kennedy or Nixon. He's like in the Vietnam War, and like no one really remembers his name, but he's just like been there for a lot of stuff. I feel like I just met so many people who dove in so many different directions, and I still feel it today. I feel like I'm kind of in the background, and I kind of like that personally. I'm not really a forefront, face in front of everybody kind of guy, but it's been interesting because I've just had a chance to see a lot of stuff in the background, stuff that people don't see. And I think it humanized like the whole spectrum of Mormon and Mormon adjacent like stuff that I've been able to encounter. Like I've met Don Bradley, I've met Dan Peterson. I've also met John DeLynn. Like my oldest sister and her husband were friends with him at one point up in Logan when they were doing the Oasis project still. But
wasn't he from Texas too? Didn't he grow up
yes,
in Texas?
yeah. He's also impossibly tall in real life. But I'm also like
much taller than I ever imagined. I had
Yeah.
interacted with him a lot before I actually met him, and I met him at an event. I'm like, oh my god, because when you interact with people online, you don't know. Sometimes they're much shorter, and in his case, he was much taller.
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
that's
and in
just
my
so
case,
interesting.
I'm the guy who genuinely thought he was 5'10", only to find that I think I'm about like 5'8" at best. Like so,
Oh,
yeah.
so you're a 19-year-old atheist apologist, and you do what every 19-year-old atheist apologist does, and you go on a mission. Tell us
Yeah.
how that transformation
How did that
occurred.
happen? That's right.
Yeah, so I definitely had a very strong testimony at that point. But it was kind of more like it was a mishmash of Terrell Givens and N.T. Wright. So the way that I really rationalized it in my mind was I just dropped the Mormon exclusivism altogether. I didn't really care about the one true church thing. I had sort of like turned Mormonism in my mind as like a symbolic sort of expression of this cosmic narrative everyone's already involved in. So it's not like you think of like the temple narrative, like you didn't have to earn your way into having been in the pre-existence. You didn't really have to earn your way or like ritualize your way into being born in this world. And I sort of thought the same thing about like the 3 degrees of glory and stuff. The thing that I really focused on came from N.T. Wright, which was this idea that like Christianity was meant to better the world. So there's this his analogy was the book of Acts, where it begins with Jesus sort of handing off this kingdom work to his disciples. And the first thing they do is they have Pentecost, where all these barriers are breaking down between people. And it progresses where this message of good news and no longer having to be hostile toward your fellow human beings spreads further and further until you get to this point where Paul is under the Roman emperor's own nose testifying about Christ and how he's Lord and Caesar is not. And the book of Acts doesn't have an ending. And the way N.T. Wright interpreted that was because you are the next chapter if you're supposed to be a disciple of Christ. And so that was a big motivation for me as a missionary, was as I guess this is my concrete way of going about that. And I found very quickly that was a very unpopular explanation for why you're on your mission.
I'm sure half the people didn't even understand what you were talking about when you brought up the Romans, Paul, Acts, and the Pentecost.
The Bible's already got an interesting mix of opinions from certain missionaries. So it was, where's the Book of Mormon fit into that? What's wrong with you? Like that kind of thing. Exactly. Where's the church?
Where's the church? So where did you serve then?
I was in the California Fresno mission, which has since split in half. I think it's now the Fresno and Modesto mission, but we had like the whole San Joaquin Valley. So we had Modesto, we had the Yosemite National Park, all of Fresno. We had a bunch of vineyards that the church owns to create raisins. I actually got to
say.
Yeah, that's right. I worked in those vineyards, actually, probably in a slightly questionable amount of free labor, but I actually really enjoyed it, mostly because I was not a fan of proselytizing. I've never enjoyed that part of my mission. It was the hardest thing to try to explain to other missionaries that like, hey, I really don't like the sales portion of this whole thing. I'd rather be a humanitarian, and cutting grapes off of a berm was probably one of the funner things I got to do.
But you were literally laboring in the vineyard. I mean, that's incredible. Like,
in the Lord's vineyard.
Really
there you go. Yeah, I learned a lot about it.
Well, so you definitely had a different point of view and a different way of seeing things from the other missionaries and your mission president. I mean, talk about that maybe a little bit, just the whole dynamic there, because
yeah, absolutely. So I had 2 mission presidents. One was Larry Gelwicks, who's a very famous rugby coach from Utah, very accomplished.
From Highland. I live
very
close. Yes, I know exactly who you're talking about. How interesting.
Yeah, he's a great guy. I know he's had complicated relationships with a few other missionaries, and I'm sure if we got to know each other better during the time that I had him as my president, we probably would have had a little more complicated relationship as well. But he was a good man. I think he kind of sensed that I was just kind of a square peg in a round hole, and I was just trying to do my thing. And I think he kind of just didn't want to make life worse for me in some ways. But yeah, it was my second mission president, however, that I had the most conflict with, unfortunately. I think that kind of the through line for a lot of conflict I had with my second mission president, with a lot of mission leaders, and with a lot of missionaries in general, was just like this. It was a mix of misunderstanding, a lot of, quite frankly, just bullying, if we can be honest here at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, shocking that a bunch of 18 to 20 something boys would be bullies sometimes, but we tracked high school in with us.
That's a reality.
Yeah, it really is. Well, and it's a reality that you get when you have young men, especially who have perhaps mental or even psychiatric disorders that aren't being diagnosed. I was with an elder for 6 weeks. That was the darkest 6 weeks of my entire life. He was my district leader. I was suicidal when I was with him, and I've been open about that before, but I was, that was a struggle I had, which should probably explain just how fun of a guy he was. But the two companions I had prior to him, the one immediately prior to him was sent in to sort of clean up the area that I was supposedly failing to baptize in, even though this area had not seen a baptism in like a couple of years since I even got there.
But it's on you. Yes,
yeah,
you're the one, and you failed. Oh, dear.
Well, and within half a week of knowing me, that previous companion reported me to the mission president as not working. I was being lazy, everything, to the point that my second mission president sent me an email out of nowhere saying, essentially, I don't think you have a testimony. I don't think you're converted. I sent it to my dad, and we had a very quick back and forth trying to draft up a response to that email, shaving away each other's profanity. It was not a nice email.
Blankety blank blank blank. Well, yeah. Oh,
I mean, kind of like I'm not sure what the threshold of language is here for your podcast. I definitely don't want to get you guys demonetized. But
you can say whatever you want.
Well, I wanted him to go fuck himself. Like he
in the nicest way possible.
Yes.
In the rudest way possible. I was very much a kind of a tit for tat kind of guy. I mean, it's right. that Texas individualism, I think, too, where it's like, act up, get snatched up, Yeah. I don't care if you're my mission president. You don't get to talk to me like that. I don't talk to you like that.
And your dad agreed. Your dad found the letter to be offensive, and he was on board with you. Okay.
So this is a very interesting point in my mission, because I had a string of 3 companions. The last one was the one I was most suicidal with. The second one is the one I'm kind of describing. I was with him at the time of this email. And the third one prior to that, we just didn't work very well. Very, very different personalities. He was kind of, born and raised in Utah. He didn't really think about Mormonism too much. It was just kind of the thing he did, and I don't think he really wanted to be bothered with it, which is, fair enough. We ended as business partners, essentially. But it was a rough one. And then, so this second companion came in, reported me to the mission president as supposedly being the busted leg of the entire mission. And I was sent 2 zone leaders, one of whom I had seen get trained, and one of whom was a very, very good friend of mine. They came into our area shortly after this email when I thought everything was settled, because I didn't get a reply from my mission president. I just got his weekly email right after that saying, here's my spiritual thought for the week. And I was like, I got a couple thoughts for you, but they're not very spiritual. But I figured everything was done. So these 2 zone leaders, though, came into my little podunk area in the middle of nowhere. And we had a district lunch at Taco Bell. And they're like, hey, Elder Smith and Elder so-and-so, let's go back to your apartment and just hang out for a little bit. I was like, cool, I get to hang with my friends, neat. So we get into my apartment, the door closes, and they say, hey, the real reason we're here is because we've been told to come and interview you, Elder Smith, me. Mission president basically sent them to give me a worthiness interview. So I was asked essentially all the baptismal questions with a lot of footnotes and asterisks to make 100% sure of what I was actually saying. It was one of the scariest times on my mission. I had a rifle pointed at my head on my mission. That was probably a little scarier, but this was probably one of the most spiritually unnerving moments of my entire life, because I thought I was going to be excommunicated. like for real, I thought I was going to be like kicked out of the church for a minute there. I didn't know my other companion had essentially made this accusation in the first place. So he's just sitting there with me. I don't know that he's the reason this whole thing happened. And I'm getting asked these questions like, do you believe we have a priesthood? What does that mean? Do you believe that the prophet is, authorized to receive revelation of the mind and will of God, et cetera, et cetera? And I remember being very, very angry and also in a desperate need to use the bathroom several times because I had been drinking a lot at the Taco Bell, which was good because it gave me a concrete moment to be like, hey, I need to step out of the room for a minute. You know why? And it gave me a chance to breathe.
And they let you use the bathroom.
Yeah,
I was going to say
absolutely.
that's absolutely an atrocity if they're not even letting you use the bathroom in their
Yeah.
It's like the mission president set the Danites after you or something. This is, oh my God.
Yeah, well, I mean, he had some interesting influence on people. I've since spoken with those two missionaries. One of them at least apologized to me. He really did a lot to advocate for me, and I think that, especially at this perspective, I think I understand that he was in a losing game, that the only way for him to step out of it was essentially to leave his mission. So it's understandable. But I remember in that time I channeled a lot of Mormon stories and a lot of Mormon matters with Dan Witherspoon, because I listened to especially a lot of Dan's podcast. Because
Dan is awesome.
Yeah,
Dan
he's lovely.
wonderful.
I was a big fan of Dan. I think that he's wonderful. I got to find a lot of interesting people through him. But I remember at the time as a kid, I was enamored with this idea of being kind of a mover and shaker in the church. And obviously that dream was dying really quickly. But I remember as a kid, I would imagine myself being interviewed. And so I gave my interview answers. I was like, how would you respond if Dan asked you that question? So I was able to talk calmly, and I was able to speak in kind of a nuanced way. I also lied a few times. I mean, what do you want from me? I was a scared 20-year-old, I think at the time, maybe 21. But even the lies that I told at that time were not even like that desperate of lies. They were just more like, you're not going to take the Terrell Givens answer. You want the Bruce R. McConkie answer. So here's the Bruce R. McConkie answer. And now you're happy and everybody can move on.
Pulling them out, whatever they need, right? And you knew how to gauge it. Oh my goodness. What an
experience. As a psychotherapist or future psychotherapist, you're the guy here who needs to name that mental state that missionaries end up in when they go on a mission. I mean, it happens to you just see a large percentage. I'd guess 70% end up with some sort of an issue, or they come home, or depression. It almost needs its own name. So that's my challenge to you, is to find that and name it.
I will have to work on that. It's funny. I'm a big fan of psychoanalysis. It's a slightly controversial field, but I found that actually helped me make sense of a lot of my experiences. I think that for especially missionaries, but for a lot of Latter-day Saints in general, the Center of Mormonism is not, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, I mean this in a purely neutral way. I don't think the central concern of Mormonism for these folks is truth. I think truth is a means to an end. And I think the ultimate concern for them is capital A, authority, which leads to security. So for them, I think Mormonism is not so much what is, but what should you be? And if you're going to have someone articulate to you what you should be, then they need to be reliable. They need to be authoritative. And hence we get behaviors where people are very, at the very least, anxious if you start to maybe poke holes in the idea that this authority figure is not, we won't say infallible, but they will be functionally infallible, in the sense that, I mean, we all know that President Russell M. Nelson's just a human being, but God help you if you actually point out a problem he's actually caused. Like, we love to point out, like, oh yes, well, we were racist in the past, but if you point out any racism now, that's when we start to tug our collars, because it disrupts that experience of having a reliable authority figure tell you all the things you should do in order to escape what you're trying to get away from, which at times is often just like things you can't control. It could be economic issues, it could be depression and anxiety, it could be self-loathing, it could be estrangement from your family, your loved ones, a feeling of isolation. It could be all kinds of things. And it just kind of gets pulled into this structure of what I would call unearned authority. And I think that the thing that disrupted my mission the most was this is such a cringy way to put it, but I feel like I saw the emperor's new clothes for what they were. And people, whether they realized that or not, were not happy with me about that. And they took it out on me.
Oh yeah, you saw behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz, you knew. So
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. Just the whole focus, such an incredible focus on obedience. You need to have
Yes.
that authority figure.
Well,
And you
yeah, absolutely.
it
Sorry,
reminds me
yeah.
that we're like, it reminds me of we went to a discussion with Maxine Hanks, and she said something so interesting. She said, I never ever gave my authority away to the church. It was okay. Whatever they did to me, whatever happened, I was okay because I never gave my personal authority the way, to them, which is so interesting because I think the mission is probably all about that. You give everything up, right? You
Yes.
give it all to the mission and to the obedience and to the authority figure, which makes you so vulnerable if you really do that. So
Yeah,
did you pass that interview?
I like this term, unearned authority.
Yeah.
Unearned authority. I guess they earned it because they outlived everybody else, but that's the only seems to be the only qualification.
Well, and I think it's why it's such a desperate emphasis. Well, maybe not desperate, a firm emphasis, let's say. I want to be as neutral as I can be, because I think Mormonism can survive without this part of it, by the way. And this was one of the reasons I think I saw through it so quickly, was because for me, it just wasn't a concern. So I was always surprised when people are like, what do you care if we stayed up past 10:31 p.m.? Like, why do you think the cosmic shotgun is aimed at us now? Like, calm down. And I didn't understand at the time, but I think that this is kind of one of the reasons why the Nelson administration is so emphatic about prophets only teach you the truth. And this is the mind and will of God, especially in a really turbulent set of changes for the administration, whether it's something as simple as finally equalizing, gender dynamics in the temple, or something as dynamic and interesting, but we'll see where it goes, as like donating to organizations that help LGBT plus people, or working with the NAACP. It's a time of transition. We'll see how far the church actually transitions, quite frankly, but it's the way that you stabilize the church during that transition is, I think, you emphasize, like, this is God doing the actions. This is the capital A authority figure. You don't need to question it. You can just trust it. It's fine. Because the moment you start to ask, like, okay, is this the right decision? Or how do I actually feel about this? Is the moment that you have to reintroduce that anxiety of uncertainty.
Very interesting.
I absolutely agree. No, that really is. So you passed your interview, I'm guessing, with the Danites that came, and did you complete your entire mission then, even though the circumstances were absolutely so difficult for you?
Yeah, so I did complete my mission. I passed the interview, I would say probably with a B-, maybe a solid B, I don't know. But I remember having a chat with one of the zone leaders afterward, like a week afterward, because I was, as you might imagine, kind of curious, because for some reason the second mission president had a way of sending the Danites and then never sending a verdict as to what his
left you hanging.
Yeah, I mean, and I made like when I sent that email to him, and I very respectfully said, hey, I think you've been misinformed. I'd love to talk with you and see if maybe we can clear this up. I would kindly suggest maybe not sending such a sudden email to someone that you haven't actually met yet. I'm sure he loved that. But yeah, I remember talking to this zone leader, and he told me that I was now off the president's radar, which essentially meant I just wasn't going to have zone leaders knocking on my door anymore. He was still very aware of me and probably quite wary of me, but it is what it is. So after that, I only had, I think, 3 transfers left. So I was told in a private interview by my second mission president, while I was with my third just awful companion, and I was suicidal. So during that time, I borrowed a cell phone from another set of missionaries because I didn't want to see my companion to see I had made this call. And I called the mission president's wife, because when you're a missionary, I don't know if it's still this way. There's fortunately some more mental health resources than there used to be. Still a little thin, but At the time, it was you call the mission president's wife if you're depressed or anxious because something feminine touch, something, I don't know. But so I called her and I told her, hey, I might be about to hurt myself. Can we chat? So I left her that voicemail. I got a call back later that evening, and she gave me I don't want to shame her, but she gave me the best advice I think she knew to give, and it was unfortunately not very helpful. But she asked me, can you survive 2 more weeks, which was however long we had left of that transfer. And I was like, I guess. But I went to my mission president because he said, hey, I emailed him as well. And he said, look, I'm doing an area set of interviews. We can just talk then. I was like, cool, thanks. Glad you could pencil me in. But I talked to my older sister about this, and she said, you really should have made a bigger scene. And hindsight's 2020, but who knows? But so
was
I
this
talked
the
to
first
him.
time you'd been suicidal in your life, or had this been
Yes.
something that you'd experienced before, or do you attribute it to the mission itself that made you that way?
It was 100% time on my mission. At worst, I was a socially anxious kid at times in high school, and that's about it. Never since then have I even really considered that sort of thing. Even it was that, if that contextualizes it a little bit, because I wasn't prone to this sort of thing. I didn't have a history of suicidal ideation, and I actually still don't, which should probably tell you about the circumstances I was in, unfortunately. But so I talked with this mission president, and I told him about the things that were going on, and he told me that this was something he had been hearing about this missionary way too much. So apparently I was not the only one complaining. And yet he was still a district leader. So he told me, in 2 weeks, when the transfer happens, I'll remove him from the area. You'll stay there. So in 2 weeks, we got the transfer calls, and I was removed from the area, taken down to the very edge of the mission, and doubled into a teeny tiny area with another missionary who was also about to leave. Or rather, I had someone who was just out of training for one transfer, and then 2 transfers, I believe, with someone who was also going to leave at the same time that I did. So I basically got told one thing and was given another thing. But I remember the ride down away from that area, away from that missionary, being probably one of the giddiest times of my life. I was just happy to be gone. Yeah, I was just happy to be away. It was one of the most abusive relationships I've ever had in my entire life, and he was just like some 18-year-old jackass. Like, like, he doesn't have that much power, but we play this interesting game with each other, especially when we insert authority into the situation and obedience and what you should be and who you're supposed to trust and obey. And yeah, it made a bad situation. So it wasn't until a transfer after I left that he was removed from being a district leader. I spoke actually to a missionary who was a good friend of mine at that time, who kind of helped me get the cell phone that I needed to make the call and everything. And he told me at least that when I left, it became a lot more apparent what this missionary was doing, because it got harder and harder to hide something. I don't know if he was like sociopathic. I think he had a difficulty registering distress in other people, which is a pretty, antisocial personality disorder kind of trait. But one of the things about that is that people kind of think that, oh, these psychotic people, these psychopathic people rather, they occupy these positions of authority and they never get questioned, and they just had to claw their way to the top and no one can ever take them down. The actual truth is that when you're like that, you don't get to stay anywhere long, because people start to see through you pretty quickly. And I think people saw through him. He was removed from being a district leader, and I tried to play it off as just, well, I was tired of it. I didn't want to lead. I just wanted to be back on the streets. And apparently no one believed him.
The streets of the mission. No, and I can tell you, unfortunately, that this still goes on. My son has been on his mission since October, and he's already had an experience just like yours, first out of the gate. And same thing. He was transferred and is now in a teeny tiny little, it's literally unfolding, and he's only at the very beginning. So I'm sure many people listening or watching can understand these experiences, but you served honorably, right? That's what everyone's going for.
Yeah, I got the 2 years.
You made it, and you came home, and yet the experiences, the shadows from your mission followed you. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because I think so many can relate to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my first weeks home, when I gave, I think, my homecoming talk, I remember I was in, gosh, it was either the second hour or elders quorum back when there was still 3 hours of service. And I remember the elders in the ward of my parents were, that were serving in my parents' ward, they came to meet the RM. Why not, And I remember seeing them, they just sat down right in front of us and I couldn't breathe. I felt like there was just this like pressure sitting on my chest. I felt so defensive against these boys that I had never even spoken to before. And I was just scared. And I didn't understand it at all. I didn't know what was happening to me. I knew that I had had a horrible experience as a missionary. I just didn't understand why this was happening because I was home. I was released. It was fine, right? But I guess it had traumatized me. That's how trauma works. You see a stimulus that matches something like the circumstances that characterized your initial traumatic experience, and your mind and your body start to respond in the exact same way they did before. All those unprocessed emotions and physical sensations come back up again. And I like to tell people too, that was actually a good way of knowing I was healing too, because I remember when I lived in Provo, I did a brief stint at BYU. But when I lived in Provo, I ran into a couple elders on the street corner when I was on my way to the post office. And I just looked at them. They looked at me. I said, "Hey, how's it going?" They said, "Hey," and they went on their way. I went on mine, and I didn't feel a thing. And it was a good sign, but it was a lot of PTSD that I honestly just didn't realize was there. And honestly, I had to kind of deal with it on my own. I was fortunate that I had two marriage and family therapists in my family at the time, my brother-in-law and my oldest sister. She was completing her master's at BYU in marriage and family therapy. He was completing his PhD there in the same field. And I remember, in fact, when I was with my companion with whom I was suicidal, she sent me an email. The first weekly email I sent them when I was with that companion shocked her into writing me for one of the first times in my entire 2 years. Like, we didn't, not because we were estranged from each other, just ADHD and undiagnosed ADHD, I guess. But she sent me an email and she said, "You sound like a battered spouse, and I need you to request an emergency transfer." Like, she told me, I'm a mental health professional in training. If you want to cite me on anything, like, you need an emergency transfer. And I wrote a resignation letter to my mission president, like telling him I want to go home and I'm done. I kept it in my pocket for a week. It had an envelope. It was addressed. It was stamped. It was ready to go. And I never sent it. And I don't know. I think I'm glad I didn't send it. But I that was kind of the only resource I had was a couple family members who were therapists who could never be my therapist, of course, for ethical reasons. Right. Yeah, from the most part, I just had to deal with it on my own.
So you looked for and found your own solutions, sort of, once you recognized what this was. Because I would think that would be interesting to go, why do I feel so strange? Why am I so upset? What is this? And then recognize, oh my goodness, it's supposed to be the best 2 years of your life. Literally, when you recognize what happened to you there, and then you're searching for ways that you can heal from that. So maybe talk about that, because I think that part of your journey is really interesting and it's so beneficial to others, the things that you've learned. And even choosing had you imagined that you would go into the field that you went into before this, or did this really open the door to all of that? I'm so curious about that.
I think I didn't even dream of becoming a therapist, to be honest, until relatively recently. At the time, I wanted to write big books on Mormon thought and history, and I wanted to be very profound, and I wanted to be the mover and shaker. And that dream hadn't quite died just yet at that point. Or I should say, it hadn't evolved yet. I feel like a lot of that I've taken into wanting to be a therapist. But at the time, for some reason, I was lucky enough to run into these little sound bites and clips from a philosopher named Alan Watts. He was a British-American philosopher. He used to be an Anglican priest, and he did a lot to popularize in the 60s and I think 70s Eastern thought in general. So Hinduism, yoga, Tantra, Zen, Taoism, all of it. And he had these audio recordings where he just did a lot of lectures before he died, and people would set them to nice music and good stock footage. And I remember for hours, I would just watch these like 2 to 4 minute clips listening to him talk about like this this way you could relate to the world, and like the problem that you have is this thing called ego, and there's a deep down layer of yourself you've never met before, and it all sounded like gibberish at the time. For some reason it just like really caught my attention. I remember I was I think one of the most profound spiritual experiences I've ever had in my life, even to this day. I was reading about the ego, and I didn't know what that word really meant. Like I knew like, oh, the self is an illusion, all those fun catchphrases. I don't get it. And I remember I was in Provo in my little apartment, and I was in my room, and I was kneeling down doing my evening prayers before I was going to bed. And I was thinking to myself, like my prayer just sort of stopped. And I thought, like, suddenly I thought to myself, everything you think about yourself is too small. Like you are much bigger than everything you have ever thought about yourself. And suddenly I realized that that was what the ego was ego is just everything you think about yourself, and realizing it's an illusion, it just means that you realize that you are much more complicated than anything you could ever say about yourself or think about yourself. And for some reason, that made me weep, like just deeply. Like I think I recognized that there really was a me that I had never met before. And I think that was the me that was agonizing every time I ran into missionaries, or it was the me that would get like anxious being invited to a YSA, or angry with a bishop at a YSA who says my previous YSA bishop didn't know me, so are you following the commandments, or things like that, like I was suffering and I didn't even know it. And I think that recognizing, what the ego was, essentially what people meant when they were trying to say this sort of thing, really opened me up to that. Meditation ended up becoming a natural sort of thing from there. I just mostly was into mindfulness at the time initially, just sitting quietly with yourself and like, trying to bring your mind down just a little bit, trying to calm your body down just a little bit and seeing what comes up. And I remember those first sessions, I would just weep. Like I would be there for a couple minutes and then just something would come up. It was like vomiting from food poisoning. Like there was this thing inside of me, and there was only one way to get it out. And I was never letting myself do that until I took my conscious mind and just quieted it down as much as I could at the time. And I remember I had like 6 months after that, just solid 6 months, as if I had taken a dose of DMT or something, that I was just like, not a single thought bothered me. Not a single thing messed with my emotional equanimity. And that faded over time, obviously, but it was such an impactful moment for me that it dramatically changed me, and it made me realize there was a way that I could live my life differently.
And you were in the church at this point off your mission, and you were healing. What was the relationship between your continued healing and how you were starting to feel about the church? Was there a little give and take between that, or were you still solidly in, or how did that work?
Well, ever since my time with Fair Mormon, I stopped seeing the church as a father figure and more as a sibling. So there was always this kind of disconnect between us. I never really felt uncomfortable seeing the church as human. Like we make mistakes, but you should also acknowledge those mistakes, because mistakes have concrete consequences in the lives of people. But when you're essentially masquerading as an institution that either doesn't make mistakes, or mistakes are the exception to an otherwise very firm rule, so why bother addressing them in the first place, you get injuries, unfortunately. But so I never really had a hard time disconnecting from the church in that way. I think that I gradually drifted away and just became inactive. When I was at BYU, I tried the YSAs. My first roommates were very kind. They carpooled with me. I went every week. I noticed that I had a hard time talking to people. For some reason, people didn't really feel drawn to talk to me either. I think it's a mix of being in your 20s, being college students, being kind of cliquish, and also I was just awkward. But then I got to my second ward. That was the bishop that asked if I was following the commandments right after hearing. He's like, he told me he called my previous YSA bishop, who I'd never met in my entire life, because it was just at BYU YSA. Like everyone's moving in and out. There were hundreds of kids in that ward every Sunday. I was like, oh, he didn't hear about me, huh? Did you hear the Pope's Catholic too? Like, what did you expect? Like, but anyway, I think for me, that was kind of the last straw where I was like, I don't get anything out of church. I haven't gotten anything out of church since I was a teenager. Like, I've never enjoyed this. I've always enjoyed Mormonism and always hated going to church. So I'm going to stop. So I did. And then I moved back to Austin, back to Texas, still inactive. I had a moment where I tried to go try again at my family's ward with my parents, and that didn't last long. My whole family at this point is basically ex-Mormon. So, you know, we all got to, I was very fortunate in that I had people who were either waiting for me on the other side who could help me kind of work my way forward, or I had people who were transitioning with me who kind of understood when I said, hey, I'm not going to church today, or hey, I don't really believe this thing, or hey, I went drinking with my friends, like, what do you want? So it wasn't until I was about 2018 though that I realized that I wasn't making a healthy transition. I was just dissociating from my pain. So kind of similar to that spiritual experience I had, if we can call it that, of recognizing the ego and that there was a deep down self to myself that I'd never really met or addressed. I realized that part of that self that I was still kind of meeting and getting to know was still very much traumatized by the experiences I had as a missionary. So for the first time, I opened up in 2018 with a Facebook post. It was right about the time they made the change that let missionaries call their families on a weekly basis. And I saw all the fun people saying how, you know, children these days, they're so weak. Everyone needs padded corners and the snowflake generation. So I couched it as basically a response to that. You know, people make these grandiose Facebook posts like people are waiting just to hear their opinion. So I did mine. And I remember, again, weeping through writing the entire thing. And then I read it the next day and I cried a little bit. And then I reread it again and I stopped crying a little bit. And then I reread it after that and I didn't cry at all. And I realized I was processing things. So I opened up about a lot of experiences, a couple of which I talked about here today, in fact. And I got picked up by Richard Ostler somehow of Listen, Learn, Love. He invited me to come interview on his podcast. I felt like a little bit of an imposter because, you know, he specializes in working with LGBT plus people who are somehow in an intersection with the LDS Church. And at that time, I didn't really fit into that category. I was just kind of a traumatized kid. So we focused in on that. But after that, I started writing for Medium. I just made these essays, just threw them out into the ether. And one day, this young woman who is a grad student, she reached out and said, hey, I have a publication I made for part of my graduate work. Do you want to write for us? And so I was like, yeah, have all the essays. You can have all of them. And I'm the reason they have a Mormonism tab now. So I wrote over 100 essays on Mormonism, and I hit a point where I was like, I don't really have anything else to say. And I think that point was when I realized I was good.
Wow, you almost wrote yourself back to health. That's very inspiring and amazing. Sorry, Landon, I'm talking so much. I'm just like so curious. Please ask Nathan a question. I'm sorry. I'm really monopolizing the situation here.
No, I know you're big into Buddhism. When did that come into play, and how has that affected your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny enough, I don't get to talk about this a lot publicly because I don't know. I'm a mix of like, I think I'm still kind of a nun, None. I don't know if I want to like identify with anything too closely. And I also kind of have that classic Texan individualistic side of like, it's none of your damn business. That's what, like that kind of thing. But no, yeah. I was first introduced to Buddhism in any serious way through those clips that I would listen to of Alan Watts, and I would read his books. And so I got a very interesting broad perspective on Buddhism, yoga, Taoism in China and the like, and Zen especially. And that was kind of the beginning of it. Meditation was always the through line because I think that I went from, for me, the biggest transition out of Mormonism, I think, was transitioning mentally from looking for an external structure that I was supposed to live up to, and instead becoming more of an introspective person. So instead of asking, what should I be? I started to have to ask myself, what am I? And turned out I didn't actually have good answers for that question. But meditation helped. So that was kind of the through line. It took me through all kinds of forms of Buddhism, all kinds of forms of yoga, Hinduism, Tantra, Taoism, and including into like traditions that people don't really often know about, like Greek Orthodox Christian monks. They meditate. they have a meditation that's shockingly similar to what yogis do with mantra meditation in India. Like they like down to like focus on particular parts of your body, adopt this particular posture, say this string of words repeatedly for 2 hours. And then it's fascinating, and I'm sure there's some connection with the Silk Road and everything there, just mutual influence and everything with the Mediterranean and the Indian subcontinent. But I got really interested in that, and I think that naturally led me into psychotherapy, into psychoanalysis. Especially I really at first enjoyed Carl Jung, who's he's very popular, I think, mostly because I think he's very popular with folks who either used to be religious or don't know what to do with religion, whether they were or were not religious, because he tried to engage it in a very serious way psychologically, and he gave a lot of reasonable alternative ways of seeing things that I think people could like implement pretty concretely. From there, I got really tentatively into Freud. I found that he suffers from a lot of caricatures. A lot of people don't actually understand what he was writing or saying or anything, but he's also very necessarily the 1.0 version of psychoanalysis. So there's a lot of stuff in there that just isn't useful anymore, in the same way that you wouldn't pull out your like Apple II or something like that, you know? But I got really into Jacques Lacan, who's another psychoanalyst. He was credited with sort of reviving Freud in France. Funny enough, for a very brief time before he went off kind of the deep end, I was a very big fan of Jordan Peterson. I heard him speak in Austin, in fact, when he was doing his book tour. I'm not a fan anymore, but he introduced me to people like Nietzsche. He hates Lacan, and that naturally pushed me over to Lacan because I'm a deviant, and if you tell me not to do something, I'm going to do it.
I'm going to check this out.
Yeah, and it turned out I love Lacan, and he hates Jacques Derrida, and it turned out I like Derrida. I don't love a lot of people who love Derrida, but I love Derrida. But yeah, I think that I just got fascinated with this idea that there is this, I know I've said it a million times, and it's so hard to really convey it in the same way as like it's hard to verbally describe the taste of a strawberry, but there's a deep down layer of you that you haven't met, and it's just waiting to create a relationship with you. It may not be a good relationship, it may not be good at making relationships, quite frankly, but it's there, and it pulls the strings of your life in a lot like the same way like a marionette. Carl Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, you'll continue to experience it as fate. And that's basically what he meant. Like there's this layer of you that's pulling strings and you don't even know it's there. It's kind of like Pinocchio dancing around, and he ironically sings, "There ain't no strings on me," but he's a marionette. Like it's just, we think we're free and we lack the language to articulate our own unfreedom, as the philosopher Slavoj Žižek would put it. And I got fascinated by that. I got fascinated by the idea that there was an unknown inside of each of us, that there was a self that we needed to live out and help to unfold and evolve in the world, that there were these big influences, even well-meaning ones, that would suffocate that self to death, that needed to be addressed. And I wanted to be part of people's journey of sort of unfolding in that way.
Have you ever read one of the first book club books that we read in the Good Book Club years ago was Free Will by Sam Harris? Remember that, Landon? Have you ever read that, Nathan?
I haven't read his book on free will. I read his book Waking Up, which I really enjoyed. That was actually my first entrance to Tibetan Buddhism, because he was trained in a tradition called Dzogchen, which is very advanced, very interesting stuff for sure. I like him as a meditator for sure. But no, I haven't read Free Will.
We would recommend it, wouldn't we, Landon?
Yeah, it was interesting. Very much, you have to say, do I agree with this or don't? Because he basically says nothing you do is your free will, that everything is already, going to happen regardless of what you choose. So makes you ponder that a lot and makes you think. So
yeah, it's funny. I don't know. I can't say that I've ever been super interested in discussions of free will, mostly because I think I just assumed that we don't have it. With the caveat, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't change. It just means that, we are expressions of something deeper that we don't really control, in the same way that like a wave on the ocean is an expression of something deeper than itself, or an apple is an expression of a tree. I'm an expression of my genome in many ways, not entirely, obviously, not everything can be reduced to genetics, but I'm legally blind because of a gene I can't control that I never chose. So I figure that's just kind of the universe we live in. I've found that my biggest concern has been with this sort of something akin to what's been called compatibilism. I don't know if this is strictly what compatibilism is, but I've been less concerned about whether or not I have free will and more concerned about whether or not I'm free to be what I am. And I think that's probably a good way to just help people who, especially because I know some people are very bothered by these debates. It leads to a very existential dread for them. I really don't know if we have a good answer for it. And quite frankly, that binary of free will or no free will may not even really make sense in the end. But I do like the idea of whether or not we're free to be what we are. And that's kind of what that was one of the reasons I transitioned out of the church. I had an older sister who's transgender, and she was transitioning into presenting as a woman. And I just saw how impossible that life in the church would be for her, and I thought that was so incredibly unfair. And I just, it was a good example to me personally, and I've had a lot of sympathy and empathy for LGBT plus Latter-day Saints, former Latter-day Saints as well, because I think they're such a fabulous example of one of the biggest failings of the modern LDS church, which is, again, that the center of the church is not truth. It's not self-expression. It's not even necessarily a personalized, let's say, relationship with God. It's about obeying an authority figure who's correct in what they tell you. And unfortunately, that authority figure doesn't have a lot of good things to say about LGBT plus people, but they still get to be seen as an authority figure. But yeah.
Well, you're coming to the book club
Yes.
in a week. This will actually air after that.
Yeah.
But we are going to record that and put it out on our Good Book Club podcast. So people who want to tune in and listen about what you have to say about meditation, that's something that's going to be out there and something that we look forward to. So I think you said the meditation has really been a factor in you and your recovery. And so I think everyone would be interested in hearing that as we get there. And so that'll kind of be the continuation of this discussion, I guess.
Continuation.
We'll be able to put that out as well.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think maybe just a last question I might have for you is if you could just kind of describe how you started your podcast, like what led to that. Tell us a little bit about that, and also tell us where everybody can find it, because I think having heard you talk here, a lot of people definitely want to know more and want to find out more about what you're thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. So funny enough, I was interviewed by Stephen Pinecker of Mormon Book Reviews, our mutual friend.
Our mutual friend.
Yep, and it was funny. We met offhandedly, just did private conversations, and one day he was like, "Do you want to come on my show?" And so I did, and then I came back, and again, and we just built a really good friendship. And one day he just like asked me, like, "Have you considered making like a podcast of your own?" And I was like, "Oh no, God, no, please don't. I don't want to do that." And he kind of pressed me a little bit more on that, and I found that actually that was something I would be very interested in. So we workshopped names. We kind of talked about what it would look like. And the iteration that kind of worked out is very different from what I initially thought. I specialized more in video essays apparently, but I really love that. I thought it was going to be an interview show. So the YouTube channel is called Mind Makes This World. You can just find it at youtube.com/@mindmakesthisworld. That's the easier URL. Again, I only have about 9 videos, but I have more content to come. And if you want to read any of my writing, though, I'm at studionightflight.medium.com. And if you want to find me on social media, I'm on Twitter at Nate Smith SNF. I'd love to chat if anyone wants to talk further, or if they want to hear any like recommended resources or anything like that. Yeah.
And I will say the video, you did great videos. The video was one of the highlights as I was watching. I was going, wow, this is really visually well done. And and then your writing that I've heard, you were reading your missionary journal in one of them. And I was going, wow, this is just beautiful, very descriptive language. So yeah, very well written and very well produced with the video.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I didn't realize that video especially was going to hit such a chord with people, but funny enough, I made a YouTube channel that wasn't centered on Mormon content, and yet all of my Mormon content is the most like well performing apparently. But
because your story resonates. It absolutely resonates in different parts of it with different people, but it's very relatable, and maybe in a way that people don't even realize, wait, that was my experience. By you verbalizing it and delving into it and talking about it, people realize, wait a minute, I haven't even processed this, but maybe something like that happened to me. So that's why it's so important. So we'll definitely put all the links to every way that you can possibly be reached, even your home phone number if you want us to.
Oh God, no, please.
Exactly. So, but no, this has just been amazing. Landon, do you have any final thoughts? And then we'll let Nathan get on with this tonight. But boy, we're so happy that you came on, and we're so excited that we get another dose at the book club meeting. So
I'm very excited. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great.
I think a lot of people have had shared experiences that you've had on their mission and with leaving the church. And so hopefully people, tune in for the Good Book Club discussion that we're going to have with you, and watch that, because I think that's going to be fascinating to see that meditation, and it's another way to think after you're out of the church, to recover from trauma, as well as, even if you don't have trauma, to focus yourself.
Yeah,
very interesting.
If you don't mind my saying, I would want to say, just kind of going off of experiences, what kind of prompted me to speak up in the first place. I was fortunate in that I actually did get to meet a couple RMs in Provo when I lived there who didn't get a chance to tell their stories, and they went through horrible experiences. And them telling me about that really emboldened me and empowered me to actually speak up. I think one of the barriers that I ran into was I felt like unless I was like a general authorities kid, or I was like mugged at gunpoint by my mission president, like some horrific, unimaginable thing, I didn't have a right to speak up. And I hope I realized that what I went through on my mission is not the worst that people can experience. It's not the best, but it's not the worst. But I still feel strongly about speaking up about it, because I would like to be kind of like what y'all were saying. I would like to be that the person that other RMs were to me, who felt like they couldn't speak up. So if you do feel like this resonates with you, just feel free to speak. Like, speak it up. It's true. It's undeniably true. That's your testimony. It's the one that you can't doubt. So absolutely, let it out.
Let it out. That is the message. And you are a champion, because I think you are speaking, and you have a platform, and you are able to speak for people that, like I said, maybe don't even realize that they have that kind of trauma or experience until they start processing it. And then that leads to healing. So you're definitely a champion. So
thank you so much.
All right. Wonderful, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, Landon. Thank you, Nathan. And I guess we'll just say goodbye for now from Mormonish. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.